So let's continue with this session, which is entitled Volatility Drivers and Causes. My name is Alfons uit de Lansink. I'm from Wageningen University, and well, I have the pleasure to chair this session. Before we start with this session, I would like to point you at these cards that you can find now on your table. And the organization, well, is asking you to put your main lessons basically from this session on these cards, and they will be collected after this session. So I suggest we start with the presentations. We have 3 presentations this session, and the first presenter is Bernhard Brümmer from University of Göttingen, and he will give his talk about food price volatility drivers. So Bernhard Göttingen is an agricultural economist, as a professor of agricultural economics in University of Göttingen. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the introduction, Alfons. We have heard already this morning about a number of important drivers, and what I'm going to plan in these to present you in these 20 minutes or so is an overview of our own empirical analysis, which maybe have the advantage of being a bit more comprehensive what you see typically published in the journals up to now. The issue, as we learned this morning as well, is still high on the agenda. We heard all the buzzwords from the ongoing EU regulatory initiative. We achieved a political agreement in the trilogue process on the MiFID framework just this January, and it's expected to become then fully politically adopted in June. Also, I would like to put the context of biofuels policies into the context of volatility measurements. That's also an important field. And just this Monday, Switzerland, in Switzerland, the young socialists have successfully collected a sufficient number of signatures to get a vote on a complete ban of speculation of financial instruments on food products by non-commercial traders. So that signals that there is still need to look at food price volatility and its drivers. What is there to add? Well, there is, of course, already a huge body of literature. The political attention has also triggered substantial response by academicians, and in journals you find a huge number of publications. You also have international organizations which publish a lot of news on or results on volatility drivers. But until now there are at least 1 or 2 fields where there is still some discussion about which driver is important or not. So it's not yet at the stage where we can announce the definite consensus on which drivers are important, as indicated, for example, by this initiative in Switzerland. We start from the existing literature, and we've scanned all scientific published articles in peer-reviewed journals and categorized them into broad groups to see first which drivers receive the most attention, and then also to split them into those papers where we have an attempt to quantify the impact of the drivers, or whether the drivers are only explained discussed at the conceptual level. So the categories we have here are financial speculation, oil prices, low stocks, exchange rate volatilities, consumption changes, biofuel mandates, weather shocks, underinvestment in agriculture, policy measures, and finally a residual category. And also those of you who are sitting in the back of the room see that one topic clearly dominates the scientific discussion, and if we extend the perspective towards papers published by international institutions, that even increases further, and that's financialization and speculation. Yeah, of the 80 scientific or so papers which we looked at here, almost half of them are somehow addressing this issue. And half of the papers who do also take an empirical perspective on financialization and speculation and its impacts on price volatility. Let me emphasize that we only looked at papers who were addressing price volatility. If you look at the papers who address also price level impacts, the number would be much larger. But I guess the overall ranking of the drivers wouldn't change too much. The next important thing which is discussed mainly in empirical papers is the oil price levels and oil price volatilities. And that's of course interlinked with those papers who talk about the impact of biofuel policies. Yeah? The topic of stocks has also been briefly discussed. Stocks would be theoretically expected to exert an impact, so that's also often looked at. The other categories are then already more less intensively discussed in the literature. So that's our starting point, and from this we identified a number of open questions which I'll try to answer through the empirical research which we've done in this presentation. So is it really justified to focus to this extent on financialization and speculation as a driver of price volatility on agricultural markets? Or is it more important to look at other things, specific policies like biofuel policies or macroeconomic policies as they might be visible in exchange rates or so? What are long-term drivers in comparison to short-term drivers? And finally, an issue which has not received too much attention beyond specific commodity groups is the issue of volatility spillovers from both external markets and also within agriculture. How are we going to address these questions? How have we addressed these questions? Well, we look at spot prices. That's first one important thing to bear in mind. In this analysis, we exclusively focus on spot prices for major agricultural commodities, and we look in total at 15 markets and group these into 5 groups according to substitution possibilities and value chains. So we look at a group of grains, major grains, but not only at grains, also at oilseeds, vegetable oils, sugar complex, and finally also we try to look into livestock, although that's probably the most difficult part of the analysis. We then take each of the markets considered and estimate price volatility by a standard approach. That's more or less a standard Garch model, so that we have a comparable basis for our further analysis in each step. Yeah? I don't want to bother you with all the detailed results on price volatility, maybe just one example from wheat, of course. Well, there is also reason, of course, to look into grains market first, because that's our famous key price for corner price for agricultural markets, both a major output and in the livestock industry a major input, and nowadays also in biofuels, of course, a major input. So this is the familiar development of the wheat price since '92, with the most visible peak 2007, 2008, and the second one 2 years later. If you do a volatility analysis, then basically all volatility measures come out quite robust, and I've tried to visualize here a bit differently the impact of price volatility by plotting some confidence intervals here around this expected price. And you nicely see that the issue of price volatility is maybe particularly important for European policymakers, because for a long period of time, before '92 at least, and maybe a bit later even, we didn't have to cope with price volatility for wheat because we had the intervention price, which essentially fixed the market price most times. And afterwards, we initially entered into better integration with the world market at a phase when price volatility was very low. And then everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but there was a bit of a surprise that prices could fluctuate that much. Okay. So these volatility measures, which are reflected here in the confidence intervals, are then what we want to explain in a second step. And how do we do that? We take the volatility measures in each of our defined groups and basically estimate a vector autoregressive model where we consider the own lagged volatilities to account for volatility dynamics and spillovers within agriculture, and then add a set of potential exogenous drivers to this exercise, to this modeling exercise. I should mention that we treat biofuel markets as endogenous to agriculture, so we estimate also volatilities for the most important biofuel markets, and then use them also as an explanatory variable in the relevant groups. And because there is still so much discussion about which drivers are actually most important, we decided to follow an automatic model selection procedure, in order to not impose prior knowledge on which drivers turn out to be important or not. We just basically throw the whole set of potential drivers in the VAR model and then let an algorithm decide which variables to retain for parsimonious model specification. Okay. What drivers are these in particular? Financialization and speculation, those two variables are measured on American futures markets, because only from the American futures markets we have the necessary information on market participants which are required to construct indices of financialization and speculation. For speculation we use the T index due to working, which measures excessive speculation, so basically takes hedging needs as given and then looks how much excessive speculation is in the market. For financialization, we use the engagement of commodity index traders in the US futures markets, always specific to the groups which we are looking at. These data, however, are only available from 2006 onwards, so for the time before we just interpolate with an exponential trend. Generally our data start around 91, 92, a bit different between the individual commodity groups. We then take into account oil prices, and both in levels and in volatilities. So there might be an impact of the level of the price, oil price, on volatilities on agricultural markets, but it could also be the case that there are direct volatility spillovers. The culprit, the suspicion for finding an impact here, is of course linked to biofuel policies, but not only. Energy is also a major input in agriculture, at least in industrialized countries. For stocks, we've also decided to incorporate them via two variables. The more common measure, which you often see in many publications, is the stocks to use ratio for the specific commodities. But we also tried to assess the impact of incoming news on price volatility. The theory of storage also predicts that news, bad news, good news, have an asymmetric impact on price volatility. And that's the reason why we try to incorporate that as well, by taking the changes from the USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate reports in the most recent months on the most ahead forecasts of ending stocks. Exchange rates, we also try to cover them with two variables. One again is capturing the level, the overall strength of the dollar against a basket of other important currencies, and also the implied volatility of the exchange rate. And finally, variables which are a bit more difficult to capture, the impact of increased consumption. We try to assess that by GDP figures for the BRICS countries, augmented by Indonesia, to have a proxy for demand growth in emerging economies. And the weather data is also incorporated by using an index for the extent of the El Niño Southern Oscillation phenomenon. So these are our potential drivers, and we don't want to impose any restrictions on that, so we throw all of them basically into the vector autoregressive models. That's how the financialization variable looks like. Basically a rather stable development here in the wheat market, monthly average position of the commodity index traders since 2006. Okay, let's go through a stylized table of the findings. In this table, we have basically by rows the categories I discussed before, and by columns we split the results now in whether they have a volatility increasing impact, whether the model selection algorithm kicks them out, or whether we find a volatility decreasing impact. So the first surprising, I don't know, remarkable result is that financialization and speculation variables are usually eliminated by the model selection algorithm. So if finance is the key, then at least in the way we've modeled it, it doesn't leave visible traces. In the few cases where finance and speculation do have an impact, it's unanonymously volatility decreasing. It seems that the liquidity effect seems to dominate the market price formation effect. If we look at the next category, the oil prices, next important category in the existing literature, we have again only a small number of significant results. They are basically also relatively anonymously pointing into the same direction. We have a price volatility increasing impact on most markets except for sugar. And for sugar we can explain that also because sugar is linked to the world oil prices because of its possibility to be turned into bioethanol, which is a substitute for oil. So also this sign is not unexpected. For stocks, we have also some significant variables, and both the stocks to use ratio plays a role, but also information changes on stocks. New information coming to the market plays a role, although again, in most cases, the impact is not significant. The low stocks to use ratio should also, according to theory, have a price volatility increasing impact, and that's what we found. The most significant impact is indeed found for the exchange rates, and mainly through exchange rate volatilities, not levels. And that's turning out to be a statistically significant driver of price volatility in 6 of the 15 cases considered, and always with a volatility increasing impact. For consumption, we find nothing, which might be due to our attempt to measure it. And for bad weather, we have also not a very strong impact to be found. You might be puzzled that there are so many high numbers in the non-significant column, but essentially that's not too surprising, because if we try to explain price volatility, which by definition are unexpected price changes, unexpected price changes from the market participants, it's not so surprising that we can't discover too many significant drivers. Otherwise, we should be able to earn a lot of money with our model, and we haven't tried that yet. Okay, but we have some results. And one striking result is that I think our data show, our results show that it's the factors external to agriculture which are mostly driving price volatility, plus the stocks. The stocks also play a role, in particular also information on stocks. I mentioned we can't model, we can't be expected to model everything here. I would also, in passing, mention that volatility spillovers within agricultural markets play a big role, and that's very nicely found in the vegetable oils complex and for grains, where substitution possibilities are very strong. That's also not too surprising. What could we learn from this in terms of policy implication? If it's the factors external to agriculture, then maybe we should ask ourselves, what should agricultural policy do about it, or would we be more forced to look into the field of macroeconomic policies in order to curb price volatility? But again, volatility spillovers, impacts of external factors on price volatilities in agriculture might also just reflect that agriculture is nowadays much stronger integrated into the overall economy than it used to be in the past. So it's not entirely clear to me whether we should try to curb price volatility in agriculture. From the internal factors, I would draw one lesson: better information on stocks would be very helpful. And those improved information, as it is of course the goal of many international initiatives, should also be provided continuously as far as possible, not only updated a few times a year. That's easier said than done, that's also clear to me. In particular, if we think about private stocks, are private stockholders willing at all to hand over the information on which they earn their money to public information bodies? Almost certainly not. But even if we look only at the field of public available information on stocks, there is scope for improvement. Financial regulation could play a helpful role if it's done correct. And that's also kind of a truism which I'm saying here. The path which seems now to be followed, at least in the European context, seems to point into a right direction as far as transparency and reporting requirements are concerned. Whether position limits will exert positive or negative impact, that will depend a lot on how the position limits are going to be enforced. You probably heard that this is basically left to the individual member states in close coordination with the ESMA. That's, to me, at this stage, an open point. My lessons learned from our empirical exercise would be, first, that we will also have to cope with volatility in the near future. It's not going to be reduced, and there is no magic silver bullet which will be helpful in cutting volatility to the level observed maybe in the 90s. We might experience also calmer periods, but basically it's here to stay. So policy probably should focus more on helping farmers, value chain actors, and also, keeping the international dimension in mind, consumers in poorer countries to cope with price volatility. And allow me maybe to conclude with a small question mark. I did not yet fully see how at least the last cap reform round points into this direction very strongly. We have been basically tackling income and environmental concerns, and also that maybe only in a way to continue with what we've done in the past. I don't see very clearly how that would help to farmers, to value chain actors to cope better with price volatility in the future. Thanks for your attention, and I hand over back to Alfons.
Well, Ben, thank you very much. Well, the program says that we are going to have a larger discussion at the end of the 3 presentations, but we can handle a few questions for clarification. So if you can keep your longer discussion questions for later, then we can handle a few short questions for clarification. If you ask your question, please say your name and your affiliation. Yes, I see a question over there.
My name is Bernhard. I'm affiliated to nobody. I'm a retired people.
Please wait for the microphone, because is there a microphone? Mm-hmm.
My name is Eckhard Gut. I'm not affiliated to anybody. Hello? Yeah, my name is Eckhard Gut. I'm not affiliated to anybody, so it's said the 3rd time. I have a question to Mr. Professor Brümmer. I was surprised that you didn't mention in the drivers of price volatility the export embargoes. They were certainly a response to increased prices, but the fact is that they increased the prices further. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, it was not mentioned there, or it is summarized somewhere. Could you clarify this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. It is discussed in the literature, ad hoc policy measures. We subsume it under the category of ad hoc policy measures. And of course, that's an important area. It's extremely difficult to get that into a quantifiable variable at the necessary frequency and to enter it into an empirical econometric modeling exercise. The fact that it had an impact on price levels is undoubted, and it's, I think, what used to be called the Metzler paradoxon. So if many countries reduce import tariff and if exporting countries increase export restrictions, then traded volumes might not actually change that much, but we will see a much higher international price, and the domestic price might be exactly at that level which we would have seen before anything would have been done. Yeah? So that's accounted in the literature. We didn't account it in the empirical modeling because it's simply very difficult to get a decent measure on the monthly frequency.
All right, there was one other question over there.
Is this on? Steve McCorrison, University of Exeter. Your results remind me of a paper by Robert Pindyck back in the early 90s about the excess co-movement of commodity prices that appeared in the Rand, which was after he threw everything in, there was still a huge residual that was unexplained when he had to cross substitution elasticity stocks, etc. It wasn't quite clear from the picture of the algorithm, but what's the proportion of volatility that's not explained after you've thrown everything in?
I would have to look it up. I don't remember the figure, but low.
Oh, no, the converse. What's the proportion of volatility you are explaining?
Maybe.
So I don't have an idea of the fit.
Less than 20% in all cases. So certainly, the spillovers capture a bit more in some of the commodity groups. For instance, in vegetable oils, we have a rather rich dynamic setting where the spillovers capture a lot. But if you look at the partial impact only of the drivers, it never exceeds 20%.
All right, so we can handle two more questions. Also a question over there, and there's a question over there. So please first. And
yes, Thierry Kesslert from Oxfam. It's a question related to, you emphasize the importance of transparency and information as an element that can impact positively the volatility. One of the aspects that you didn't mention, I don't know to what extent it also influences, is the market concentration of serial traders and kind of lack of transparency there. Does that affect also the price volatility?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it would be probably more visible in price levels than in volatility, because most models of imperfect competition would more predict that market power actually would reduce the extent to which shocks are transmitted along the value chain. So I would not expect that that's mostly visible in volatility, unless you would expect that they are trying to influence prices in certain regions to some extent. But that is something which is secret knowledge, if it's a problem at all. And so that's difficult to get an empirical evidence of that. But market structure, we know that is important for price formation. I'm perfect in agreement with that. But I would expect the major impact on levels, not on volatility.
all right, thank you. Now we have our final question.
A very quick question, Jean Ballier from FAO. You emphasize the importance of stocks. I just would like to get a clarification on what is exactly including in these stocks. Is it, I understood that you are including public stocks, national but also regionals, and private stock. Does it include enterprises but also farmers' stocks, particularly at the end of the cropping season? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. That's a very important question. What we use here are first stocks to use ratio based on the WASDE estimates, World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates. And that combines both knowledge. I mean, the US stocks, they usually try to survey also private farmers and assess what is in stocks there. But for the other countries of the world, basically, the USDA figures are guesstimates, which also have the scope of covering private stock holding, but it's not based on surveys, it's basically a balance sheet calculation. That's how we measure the stocks to use ratio. And the news coming to the market, that's again based on the World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates, but that takes always the most recent change to the forecast of ending stocks most far into the future. So really to capture what are the new information levels coming in. Yeah?
All right, thank you very much.